on the call. Look, kia ora everyone, and thanks so much for coming along this morning. It's fantastic to have you with us. My name is Brad Olsen. I'm a senior economist here at Infometrics, zooming to you from Wellington. I'm joined by my colleague Rob Hayes, another of our senior economists here at the Infometrics team, and also by Luke Shorter, who's a director at Vario, and I'll get him to introduce himself in just a moment. Look, what we're doing today is we've heard over the last few weeks, as we've talked to our clients, as we've talked to other organisations up and down the economy, that hearing about what is happening for Māori in the economy is a really important area and something that is quite often left out of the conversation. And so we're wanting to bring a few more numbers and insights into the conversation today, and also to allow Luke to have a bit of a discussion around how those numbers may shape planning into the future to help you guys out there really grasp what changes might need to happen and what sort of evolutions of planning are required as we go through this. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording this, so we'll make a copy of this available to participants later if they want to share it around and show it to others. We'll also make sure that a copy of the slides that Rob has is also made available to people. If you do want a copy of those, if you can email us at reply@infometrics.co.nz, and I'll put that in the chat later, we'll make sure that we get those out to you. Last piece of housekeeping I've got for you is we're going to discuss for around the next sort of half an hour to 40 minutes or so, and then leave the last 20 minutes or so for questions. Now, with those questions, the easiest way to do it from our end is at the bottom of your screen, you'll find a lovely Q&A button. If you can click on that Q&A button and type in your questions there, I'll make sure to curate those and put them across to the team on the call here as we go through. Final point, just so you're aware, at the moment you'll be able to see myself, Rob and Luke. You won't be able to see or hear any of the other, what have we got, 255 odd people on the call. That's just for management purposes. So feel free to make a cup of tea in the background and listen to some of the insights we've got. Luke, I'll hand over to you to give a brief introduction.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Luke Shorter taku ingoa, he uri ahau no Ngāti Raukawa me Ngāti Tamaterao. Engari rā I whānau mai au I muri te aroaro o te kāui maunga, me te awa tipua, me tērā maunga tino a tāua ko Taranaki. My name is Luke Shorter. I'm a consultant, analyst, communicator and strategist, and a bit of a varied background. I worked in software development, for universities, not-for-profits and central government. But the common theme has been around education, training and employment in general, but also for Māori in particular. Kia ora.
Awesome. Kia ora, Luke. Thanks so much for that. I'll now hand over to Rob Hayes, one of our senior economists, just to take you through how we anticipate some of the trends are going to shift for the Māori economy as we move through this, what's going to happen to jobs, and what does that mean for some of the sectors that are important to the Māori employment sector at the moment. Rob, over to you.
Thanks, Brad. I'm going to share my screen with you because I've put together a little presentation for today. Which is going to just come up in just a second. Okay, I'm going to just keep it as is. We've been doing a lot of work in the last few weeks, putting together some employment forecasts, and as part of that, we've looked at Māori employment and how that's going to change over the next kind of couple of years, and then looking out a further 5 years. That all stems in from the beginning from what our kind of general view of what's going to happen to the economy. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about our broader economic forecasts. Some of you may have heard that before, but I think it's important context to what we're doing. I'm going to talk about the various restrictions on people's ability to work under level 4 and level 3, and I've got some estimates of the number of Māori workers that have been able to operate under those alert levels and how many haven't. And then I'm going to look at Māori job losses and Māori job creation across different sectors of the economy and across the regions. I'm going to put some of those job loss numbers into context and talk a little bit about unemployment. And then I'm going to hand over to Luke to have a talk about some of the strategies that Māori can employ to get through the next few years and to take that longer view. First of all, a health warning. What I like to say is that with these economic forecasts, there must be probably a sum total of about 6 decades of experience. The people that work on these forecasts have been working on economics and economic modeling and economic forecasting cumulatively about 6 decades worth of experience. So there's a lot of expertise gone into these forecasts, but we have to balance that against the fact that what is currently happening to New Zealand and the rest of the world is an unprecedented economic shock. And when you're in these unprecedented times, it is a lot harder to foresee what's going to happen in the future. So as we gain more and more data and more information about how the economy is responding, we will continue to revise our forecasts, and they will improve. But at the moment, I would put a little health warning on these numbers. It's the best that we can do at the moment, but they probably will change over the coming months and years. Okay, I'm going to start by just looking at our forecasts for gross domestic product. So the blue line shows our forecast for the size of the New Zealand economy going forward out to 2025. That was our forecast prior to COVID-19 hitting. That was our forecast back in January this year. It doesn't seem like quite only a few months ago, but boy, have things changed since then. Our latest forecasts are seeing something like an 8% decline in the size of the New Zealand economy this year. A slight resurgence towards the end of this year as we get through those initial alert levels, level 4 and level 3, and economic activity starts to grow again. Staying relatively flat through most of next year, mainly because the job losses are going to start to accumulate, and that's going to really hold back economic growth. And it's probably not until about 2022 that the economy is going to start to genuinely recover. And it's only going to be by about 2025 that we're going to get something close to the size of the economy that we were predicting back in January. So it's going to be a rough ride for the next few years, basically. Now, when you're trying to predict the future, you have to make certain assumptions. And so I just wanted to go through some of the things that we've assumed are going to happen. And this is what shapes our overall outlook for the economy. So, for example, we've assumed 4.5 weeks at level 4 lockdown, which is, we know that's happened. We're assuming 2 weeks at level 3, which takes us out to the middle of next week. But we've also assumed that even beyond that, that there is still going to be some constraints on economic activity, either because level 3 is extended or we go into level 2, where there will be fewer constraints on economic activity, but still a degree of constraint. And so those are our assumptions going into the rest of this year. So in terms of economic activity, we assume that about 65% of the economy was able to operate under level 4, about 82% currently able to operate under level 3, and probably something like close to 90–95% under level 2. Exports are a really big part of the New Zealand economy. We export so much of our foodstuffs, and we have a lot of non-food exports as well. We think that global demand for our food exports is going to be more or less okay, because people still need to eat. There might be a little less demand for some of our premium exports, as premium food exports, as people on lower incomes have to just basically eat food that is cheaper. But we are expecting our non-food exports, a lot of our kind of machinery manufacturing, to take a hit, because we're expecting the global economy to contract over the next few years. And so a smaller global economy means less demand for some of those other kind of non-food exports. Tourism is the big story. With the borders closed, there is simply no foreign tourists going to be coming into New Zealand this year, and we've therefore assumed a 91% fall in foreign tourism this year. we're also expecting a 21% decline in domestic tourism. Now, there's a few dynamics happening there. There are going to be people, New Zealanders, who were going to maybe take an overseas holiday this year that won't be because the borders are closed. But the amount that Kiwis spend overseas when they're on holidays, certainly in previous years, is less than what foreign tourists come to New Zealand to spend. So you can't kind of swap one for the other. You can't say, well, there's all these Kiwis who are going to be taking their holidays in New Zealand this year, so that'll make up for the shortfall in foreign tourism. It won't. It'll offset it a little bit, but only to a degree. And you've also got to take into account the fact that because there are going to be a lot of job losses this year, kind of nice to have spending like holidays are going to be put on the back burner. And if people do take their holidays, they're going to look at ways to have their holidays on a budget. So maybe staying with friends, going camping, not going to the nicest restaurants in town, that kind of thing. There's been a little bit about international education in the news this week about, I think there's a current estimate is about the number of international students is about half of what it was last year. And so that's what we've assumed in terms of revenue from international education. We think that there'll be an increase in domestic education because what generally happens is when people are put out of work, that many of them go back into education. So the domestic education industry has been struggling in recent years, actually struggling to attract enrolments because there are so many jobs out there. That's going to kind of flip around now. And as I say, as more people become unemployed and school leavers leaving school and entering into a job market where there just aren't the same number of job opportunities, more people are going to go into domestic education. So that's one of the few positives that we're going to see. Again, because of those job losses, because of those lower incomes, house prices are going to drop, we think, by about 11% by the end of 2021. And that's going to drive a really big decline in residential construction. There simply won't be the same incentives for construction companies to develop new houses because they're not going to be able to sell them for the kind of prices that they're going to want to sell them. Same is the true for residential construction. Businesses are going to be more cash strapped. They're going to have fewer employees, so they're going to need less of that kind of office space. And so we're picking a 20% decline in residential construction and non-residential construction this year. But the prospects for civil construction are positive. A lot of the decisions, it's hard to predict what those are going to be because a lot of the decisions around, say, major infrastructure projects are political decisions, either by regional councils, local councils, or central government. But we are expecting an uptick this year, mainly because central government has said it's looking for shovel-ready projects. And government is coming to the party. We reckon about $10 billion will be injected into the economy through the wage subsidy scheme, and a $2.5 billion increase in social welfare benefits of $25 a week. There's also a lot of other money that the government's putting into the economy. There's been announcements recently of interest-free loans to businesses. That's all going to be a useful injection of money into the economy, which we've taken into account in these forecasts. So let me just talk a little while about that, the ability for Māori to work under these level 4 and level 3 restrictions. So this chart on the left is showing the employment of Māori across a range of industries. The blue part of the bar indicates how many Māori were able to work under level 4, and the orange part of the bar indicates the number of Māori that weren't able to work under level 4. And so you've got industries such as public administration and safety, transport, and healthcare, where these were deemed essential services. So all Māori, and in fact all workers, were able to work. You've got a number of industries like manufacturing, where certain types of manufacturing firms were deemed essential services. And so about half of that whole industry was able to work. And then you've got industries like construction, where very few people and therefore very few Māori were able to work. Now compare that with the chart to the right, where we're looking at restrictions under level 3, and you can see the number of workers that were able to work in industries like manufacturing and construction has jumped up. But you've still got some constraints. So even retail businesses, if they're able to open, they're still not able to have the same kind of flow through of customers. For those of you that have been to your local dairy or to your Bunnings in the last week or two, you'll have seen that in practice. You simply, because of the social distancing and health and safety measures that are in place, even though businesses are open, they're not able to kind of work at the same capacity that they've been able to. So we reckon that under level 3, about 76% of the Māori workforce is able to operate, which is a big jump from 53% under level 4. And this is the first big hit that the economy is experiencing, and this is part of what we're seeing in our forecasts, that there are a number of businesses who simply aren't going to make it through this level 4 and level 3. Businesses that needed a constant inflow of cash in order to remain solvent are really going to struggle. And I suspect that coming out of level 3, and once the data starts to become available, we are going to see the number of businesses in New Zealand start to fall, and the number of job losses start to rack up. So this is the first big hit to the economy that we're seeing in these charts here. The second big hit, obviously, is the closure of the borders and the impact on international education and on international tourism. And when you think about, basically that's going to take a whole lot of money out of the economy. That's money that those businesses would have been earning through tourism and education. That money's been taken out of the economy. And then therefore it affects all other businesses. And you can start to see that when I turn to the next slide and I show you some of the job losses that we're expected to see among Māori over the next 2 years. You can see businesses like accommodation and food services that would normally be serving a lot of international tourists. They're going to be hit directly by those border closures, and we're forecasting something like almost 7,000 Māori losing their jobs in accommodation and food services over the next couple of years. But then you've got industries such as construction and manufacturing that are going to suffer, partly because there's just less money and less economic activity more broadly in the New Zealand economy, and in the case of manufacturing, because of that reduction in our manufacturing exports. So this is a fairly sobering slide, I get that. We're looking at something like 40,000 Māori possibly losing their jobs over the next couple of years, mainly in accommodation and food services. But with the exception of education and training, where we might see an increase in employment because more people entering education, there is going to be no part of the economy that is going to be untouched by this economic shock that we're experiencing.
Rob, can I just interject very quickly, just to note that one of the reasons that we've just got a few questions coming through around tourism, and that tourism doesn't sit well within any of these sectors. Tourism, if you will, is spread across accommodation and food services. It's spread across parts of arts and recreation. It's spread across parts of transport. So
and retail.
And retail as well, of course. So just noting that tourism might not be up there, but it is quite well captured, I guess, in some of those key job loss areas.
Yeah, that's right. When we're producing these statistics, statistics are about putting things into pigeonholes, I guess. And the way that industries are pigeonholed is through what we call the Australian and New Zealand industry classification system. And so these are the industries that Stats New Zealand classifies, and they fit all their statistics into those classifications, and that's what we have to work with. So but part of our service is providing estimates of tourism spending and tourism employment, and we've done a lot of work over the years to try and kind of take these numbers and fit them in and and assume that certain proportions of some of these industries all come together to create our estimates for tourism. So good point, Brad, thank you. Now I'm just going to focus in on some of those, the industries with the bigger job losses next, and just compare the reduction in Māori employment compared with non-Māori. Now, what we've done here, in our previous webinar where we focused on Māori a few weeks ago, we talked about what happened during the global financial crisis, and there were two effects on the Māori job losses. One was that Māori tended to be concentrated in industries that experienced a lot of job losses. And secondly, that even within industries, Māori tended to lose their jobs to a greater degree than non-Māori. And we put that down to the fact that Māori tend to have lower skilled jobs. And it's those lower skilled jobs that tend to be cut first when economies are going into recession. So we've tried to take into account both of those effects in our current forecasts. And that's why you see across a range of industries that the proportion of Māori job losses is greater than non-Māori. So in accommodation and food services, we think that Māori employment will decline by about 30% over the next couple of years, whereas among non-Māori, it's probably closer to about 27%. And you can see that across pretty much all industries. Just taking a regional perspective, I played around with this chart quite a lot. I couldn't decide which way to kind of show you the data, but this is basically showing the number of job losses across different regions. And there's probably a couple of things feeding into this. One is just the size of Māori employment in these regions. So where in regions where there's more Māori employed, you're going to see more Māori job losses. There's also the secondary effect of that we've got forecasts of different industries, and each industry is going to lose jobs to a greater or lesser degree. And so the industry makeup of each of these regions also has an impact. So industries that are more dependent on tourism, for example, such as Otago, are going to suffer more than some other regions, such as say Bay of Plenty. But I think on the whole, it's broadly the size of the Māori workforce in each region that's determining the number of job losses. So obviously Auckland, you're going to see something like about 13,000 job losses, about 34% of all Māori job losses. And you can see that you've got the other main centres, Wellington, Canterbury, and then the other regions where the Māori population and workforce is relatively large, Waikato, Bay and Plenty, where you're going to see about a 7 or 8% reduction in, you're going to see a reduction in Māori employment of something around 3,000 to 4,000. So I just want to put those numbers in a little bit more perspective. As I said, we're expecting about almost 40,000 Māori job losses over the next couple of years. So if you take, we think that the Māori employment rate is going to fall. So that's the number of Māori employed as a proportion of the working age population. And so we think that's going to fall from about 63% just prior to COVID to about 53% in a couple of years' time. That's a drop of 10 percentage points. Now, when people exit the workforce like that, a number of different things can happen. Sometimes they can remain actively seeking work and available for work. We've already talked about people who, when they lose their jobs, they look for opportunities to upskill or reskill, so they enter education. And some, unfortunately, just become discouraged and decide to leave the workforce entirely and not look for work. And so all of those things can have an impact on the unemployment rate. And the unemployment rate is a very specific measure of the number of people who are actively seeking and available for work. So basically, if all of those Māori that become redundant in the next couple of years, if all of those remain looking for work and actively seeking work and available for work, the Māori unemployment rate could rise from something like 8% at the moment to 16% or more. But that would only be part of the story if some of those Māori decide to enter education or just leave the workforce as a whole. The unemployment rate might not rise as high. But I think we'll be keeping a close eye on this in the future, because the unemployment rate isn't the only game in town in terms of understanding what's happening to Māori in the labour market. We've got to look at the number of hours that people are working. If they're being forced to work fewer hours, we'll be looking at people who are leaving the labour force to do other things. There's a much broader picture to understand what's happening in the labour market, and we'll be keeping a close eye on that in the future. But basically, we're looking at, as I say, we're looking at Māori job losses of almost 40,000 at the moment. To put that in some perspective, the number of Māori unemployed last year was something like 26,000. So that's a pretty stark picture in terms of what's going to happen to the number of Māori unemployed. I'd like to finish on a more positive note. We think that after about 2022, the economy will start to improve. Look, there's still a lot we need to learn about how this current recession is going to play out. There's even we know even less about how the recovery is going to happen. So if there's a greater health warning on some of these statistics, but we do think that most industries are going to rebound from about 2022, simply because the borders will have opened again. The global economy will start to grow again. The domestic economy will start to grow again, and you're going to see a lot of those job losses that we've seen in the last couple of years start to be reversed, and that's the good news. At the moment, probably the only industry we think isn't going to start to recover in a couple of years is construction. We just can't see where that growth is going to come from. Even prior to COVID, we were expecting construction to start declining pretty steadily over the next 5 years, simply because we haven't seen the same kind of population growth. The population isn't going to grow as fast as it has been doing in the past 10 years, and population is a key underlying driver for construction. So yeah, it's probably the one industry where we don't think things are going to improve anytime soon. Even though there are going to be job losses in the next couple of years, there are a couple of reasons to think that there might be some pockets where there will be job vacancies occurring, partly because every year workers leave the workforce either because of retirement or because they want to have children or to go into education or other reasons. And we think that in a normal year, this isn't a normal year, but in a normal year, the proportion of workers in a given industry that would leave the workforce and therefore create job vacancies can vary between about 4% of that workforce to something like 7%. So although there may be job losses more broadly, there may be opportunities in some of these industries where basically older workers might have left the workforce and have created job vacancies. The other thing I want to talk about is the possibility that when migrants start to temporary work visa migrants start to leave New Zealand once the borders open again, that might create some job opportunities. And what I'm showing you here is some of the occupations where the numbers I'm showing on this chart is just employment, the total number of employment in some occupations. But I've chosen these occupations because these are occupations in which over the past 3 years, there's been quite a high number of migrants getting approved for work visas in these occupations. And so with a lot of work visas usually lasting about 3 years before those migrants have to return home, we would expect over the next few years a lot of job vacancies to be created in these kinds of occupations, simply because migrants have had to return home. So again, it's looking for some good news stories in what is really quite a stark environment for us at the moment. So I'm going to summarize and then just hand you over to Luke. It's going to be a tough couple of years. We estimate that close to 40,000 Māori could be out of work in the next 2 years. The unemployment rate for Māori could rise above 16%. hospitality and construction jobs are most at risk at the near term. Hospitality and most other industries should bounce back from about 2022 and beyond, but construction might not. Okay. Thanks for listening. I'm going to hand you over to Luke now, who's going to add a little bit more of perspective on what I've been talking about. Luke?
Kia ora. There you go. Okay, great. Kia ora no tātou. Thanks, Rob, for sharing all of that information with us. It's pretty grim, I know, but I was reflecting on what I might usefully contribute to this session, given it's a really broad audience, and that there are, so far, that answers are pretty elusive about, how to respond, definitively. And so instead, I've decided to have a bit of a look back, situate the conversation in a bit of a broader context, and really start with some questions on how perhaps to think about the future rather than trying to provide specific answers, because you all will have far more accurate answers about what's going to work for your various communities around Aotearoa. So, sorry, learner driver. So while this is unprecedented in our lifetimes, and certainly we're wanting to lead the way with a new response, looking back, we have been here before. It's both a cautionary tale and something we can draw some hope from, in that we have the ability to live through it and excel through it. So 100+ years ago, I don't want to lecture you, many of you will know this, but we had a very much a two-track education system. So Māori were put into farming and manual trades, Pākehā more into professions and business ownership. And for many of you in education, in and around the education system today, there will be a ring of something familiar in it. And while 100+ years ago that was positioned as, what Māori were capable of, these days we talk about where the opportunity is. And certainly we've seen that there's been opportunity in the trades area. But the fact remains that there's still occupations which are more vulnerable to economic shocks like this. And so what happened with the Spanish flu in 1918, very similar to what Rob has just outlined. So major shock in terms of Māori unemployment, in particular around the cities, to say nothing of the deaths that came from that. So really, when we're looking to the future and how we're going to respond to this, it's going to take collective action. So one of the benefits and one of the strengths of we're taking a strengths-based approach to the conversation with Māori is that we have all of the ingredients baked in for really strong collective action through our whakapapa, through our whanaungatanga, and centering our thinking around whānau, hapu, and iwi. So, looking around the world, the individualist kind of collectivist divide, I think how we as a nation have responded to COVID with really strong collective action demonstrates the value of that. And we as Māori are very strong practitioners of that collective action with all of these strengths to draw on. So despite the fact that it's, it seems really grim, I think that, we've got all of the strengths that we need to lean in. It's just about kind of how we think about it and are we asking the right questions. So as I say, I don't have specific answers for you, but I really think that how we as Māori need to be thinking about is where do we want to be in 100 years from now? So we find ourselves again, 100 years on from that last major pandemic, in a very similar situation in terms of how our workforce is balanced across high-skilled, skilled, semi-skilled, and what we should probably now be calling essential. So many of us, many of our people are more vulnerable to these economic shocks. So while we have a clear picture provided by Rob around where some of the opportunities are going to be arising in the years to come, so accommodation, food, services, and so on, and we necessarily have to respond to that, the bigger question is, where do we want to be 100 years from now, and we as a people, how do we rebalance the Māori workforce to strengthen our resilience to economic shocks like this, because it's unlikely to be the last. Where do we need system change to support that rebalancing? So from early childhood education right through the education system, do we need an entirely different approach as an addition to education, as an addition to what we currently have now? Moving between careers, how do we retrain people quickly and effectively and as cheaply as possible? So these are some of the kind of the system change questions that I think we should be considering. And then how do we equip rangatahi to not only take advantage of the short and medium term opportunities that Rob has outlined in terms of where there's likely to be job growth, but also how do we equip them to lead the necessary changes for that 100-year goal? Because we're really talking about the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of our rangatahi today. And they're going to be the ones who are going to need to lead much of that system change and lead and advocate for that rebalancing. So, yeah, these are just kind of questions that I have about, how we might put ourselves in a much stronger position as a people, in order to, better confront some of the things that might be coming at us in the future. So just some final kind of thoughts. So centering those thoughts on rangatahi, whānau, hapu, and iwi, values-focused thinking. So, in addition to, the normal indicators or indicators of prosperity, income, right? Seeing that through a Māori values lens. Availing yourselves of high quality data and insights, and I can't emphasize that enough. And of the likes that Rob has shared with you today. Considering regional relevance, as I say, what's going to work in Te Tai Rāwhiti, it might not work in Te Tai Hauauru, which might not work in Te Tai Tokerau. So, how we as a people respond is going to have to be nuanced and subtle and relevant to the regions, while staying mindful of what the national and global opportunities might be. And then finally acting today with that 2120 in mind. So that our people in 100 years' time aren't once again in the position where we're most vulnerable to economic shocks like this. Kia ora. That's it.
Kia ora. Thanks so much, Luke, and thanks, Rob. I think it's been a really useful session to go through both how some of the numbers look like they're playing out, but Luke, really powerfully what we sort of need to think about as we respond to this, some of the, I guess, key drivers of action for people to take away. Given we've got 20 minutes and we've got 30 odd questions, I think we'll jump straight into it. And I guess first, just to offer a brief apology, someone made quite the good point that with this webinar, we sort of just launched into it. We didn't have any real recognition of tikanga and that at the start, so apologies for that. We're very much learning as we go, I suspect. We're economists first and foremost, and I guess wanting to try to make sure that we're getting some insights there, but very much take on board the point that we probably haven't done enough of our homework by the looks of it, and we'll certainly take that on board for the future there. So thank you for raising that point. It's something we will go away and reflect on. With the rest of, and we've got quite a jump throughout, and I guess I'll try to collect some of them for you. Most of them, I must admit, are for you, Rob, but I think there's a couple points in there that, Luke, I'd like your sort of views on as well as we move through. And I guess the first one, and one that keeps coming up quite consistently, is around construction, and there's probably about 10 odd questions. And I guess, you know, one of the questions, Rob, is how much of this comes down to, when we look at that decline we're expecting in construction, have we factored in the potential for the government to be spending more, and what's that relativity there? And I've got a follow-up question to that, but how exactly are we seeing that decline in construction happen when the government might well be investing more in infrastructure?
Yeah, and we think that infrastructure investment is going to increase. It's just that that's only one part of the picture. You've got to take into account that the whole construction industry is residential construction, houses. We're not going to need many more houses anytime soon because the population is going to stop growing. There's non-residential construction, which is kind of big projects. Some of it's office space, but it can also include kind of other kind of business premises and anything from schools to museums or whatever else. And you know, with businesses being so cash strapped and also councils and other kind of government agencies, there's not going to be a great deal of investment in those kinds of buildings. So it's really the civil construction side of it is the only part of the construction industry we're expecting to grow, but it's only one part of the industry. So that does feed into our models to the extent that what we know of what the government wants to do and what we anticipate the government is going to want to do, so that we feed that in as much as possible, but it is only one part of the broader construction industry, and across the whole industry we are expecting to see a broad decline.
And I guess as well, and a point I'd love your comments on here, Luke, is, you know, and a number of people have raised in their questions as well, is that from a standard economic point of view, if you will, we feel like with lower net migration and that coming through, there's not as much need to build houses to the same level. Now, that's just purely because the growth numbers have come off. But of course, we know that a lot of people live in much more precarious housing situations, as well as possibly housing situations that don't meet their needs. And I guess I wonder if there is a perfect opportunity for Kiwi Build, as an example, to actually start working or to get more housing going that is going to actually meet people's needs out there. And I think as well, when we look at some of the housing providers out there, a real need to involve Māori more in that to ensure that when people are looking for housing, that their needs are being met, they're sort of not just being fobbed off. I mean, what is your feeling around that one, Luke? Oh, there we go, he's back. Luke, are you there?
Yes, I am. I'm back now. Yeah.
Fantastic. Did you hear my question, or?
No, I didn't.
Oh, that's
no.
right. Okay, I'll give you the brief version then. I was just talking about, obviously, we expect that housing doesn't seem to need as much growth coming through in the future, but that also ignores, I guess, the fact of many people being in more vulnerable situations, and I guess that the potential that lower construction activity might have to allow more Māori providers, more people to come in and actually provide direct housing to people that need it in a way that they need it. Is that something we need to be considering more in the construction space?
Do you know that's actually outside my
that's
sphere
outside,
of...
that's cool.
outside yeah.
That's fine. There were just a few comments that came through because of that, and I thought it was an interesting one to put forward there.
Yeah, one of the constraints that Kiwi builders faced in the past few years is that the construction sector has been working at full capacity. There just hasn't been any ability to add more houses to what was already being built, and so in a sense that the coming recession is an opportunity for government to step in and put money into building houses that wouldn't normally have been built. And that's probably the first time since the scheme was envisaged that we can say that. So it's kind of like a silver lining.
Awesome, thanks for that, Rob. Just going through a bit more, and I guess one of the key issues with this, and you know, it's a conversation we've had in previous times, Luke, as well, is that we know that as we move through the economy or time in general, that regardless of COVID, we do have an aging European population, but a much younger cohort of Māori who come through. And prior to this, the conversation was very much trying to ensure that where we did have young Māori coming through, that we were actually able to get them into the jobs, that they could start earning money to support the family and that. I guess, what is that different profile going to do as we move through this? And I'll ask it to sort of both of you. We have this younger cohort coming through. We have this need to reimagine both how we do business, but also I suspect how we do education to get people into those businesses, into those jobs. What changes are we going to actually need to see on an education basis to get people moving again?
I estimate that about 31,000 Māori school leavers are going to leave school in the next couple of years, and about 20,000 of them won't have reached NCA level 3, and so those are vulnerable people. I think the research has been done in terms of how to support young people leaving school when the job opportunities are more scarce than they generally are. It is about either getting them back into education, or at least helping them maintain an engagement with the labour market, helping them develop work-based skills, helping them kind of upskill and get into the kinds of professions that we know are going to see some job growth in the next few years. And in a sense, those people that are entering tertiary education now to do a course that maybe is 3 years long, they want to be doing it in the kinds of courses where we are going to see job growth in the next few years.
Any thoughts from you, Luke?
Yeah, so in terms of the population changes over the next 20 years, so we're going to see significant growth in the Māori population region, either decline or much more modest growth in the working age population of non-Māori. So workplaces are going to become more Māori over time. And I think that businesses, there's an opportunity for businesses to start considering what their workforce development strategy looks like, and how they're going to develop their Māori staff, engage with Māori prior to entering the workforce, so while they're at school, or during career transition. So I think that's one part, is that more businesses are going to have to consider what the Māori element of their workforce development strategy looks like. The other part is around education. So I really think that there's an opportunity for us to extend or augment how we approach education and training today, and I think that Māori could be a major beneficiaries of that. So that standard linear path of go to school, finish school, go into perhaps a 3-year degree, and then into a career. That perhaps there could be much more kind of agile in-work training, so employers providing on-the-job training, allowing for people to move much more nimbly between sectors, but also getting Māori rangatahi job ready much more quickly. And there's an open-mindedness, I think, or a growing open-mindedness across corporate New Zealand anyway, around not necessarily needing a degree in order to get a skilled job or a high-skilled job. That really it's about kind of aptitudes, attitudes, and getting the opportunities to learn, but particularly on the job.
Cool, thanks for that, team. One of the other, I guess, key areas, and I'm trying to sort of theme them because we've got a huge amount of questions coming in and we're just not going to get through them all, but one of the issues that has come up in a few questions is around tourism as we move into the future, and also noting that quite a lot of iwi have invested some of their funds, their commercial portfolios are structured more around sort of tourist operations a little bit more. And one of the questions, and I think it's a good way to put it, should iwi be considering a bit more of a refocus of their investments towards the likes of human capital operations and I guess more professional, scientific and technical service elements if we think of it from an industry level. Views from you guys on that sort of point?
I think I would say I'm not a not a financial advisor, and I'm not an advisor to iwi, but I think generally speaking, I'm going to take this from a kind of a regional economic development perspective, and the touchstone for quite a while now in the practice of economic development is diversity, because diversity can bring resilience. So, you know, we went through a recession after the GFC. We're going to go through one now. We're probably going to go through another one within the next 10 years. They're all different. They're all caused by different factors, and they all impact different industries differently. And I think that the best way to create resilience in that is to have a diversification of your investments across different industries.
So my perspective on this is not so much from a financial investment perspective, but where I think iwi, you know, could be investing their attention in terms of, you know, building up rangataki. I think iwi should look to move into spaces where government can't, or where it moves too slowly. So innovation and education, I think, is a really good place for them to be playing in. At the same time, you know, recognising that they're wanting to hold government to account for their performance and delivery to Māori, so not kind of letting government off the hook in that regard. But I think that, you know, prototyping, testing, and you know, delivering for rangatahi Māori, like how to shift the needle for rangatahi Māori is where I'd like to see, you know, iwi attention invested kind of beyond scholarships and actually kind of into that kind of the agile training space.
Cool, thank you. A few more questions coming in, and I guess particularly looking at, and Luke, I mean, we've mentioned education. Now, getting the right education settings and ensuring that not only are Māori able to participate, but actually, you know, leading the way rather than having to just follow the model, if you will. That does take time, I guess, and one of the issues is that for a lot of things we don't have quite as much time. So in looking more at the short term over the next sort of 2 years or so, what are some of the ways, and even possibly in the next 2 months, what are some of the ways that we need, that Māori need to be thinking, I guess, differently in terms of how they approach business, how they approach employment? And I guess just to kick that off, and a few comments that I've seen coming through in our questions is around the likes of, look, we're doing a bit more local purchasing. Do we need to start having, you know, Māori made coming through a lot clearer, or at least making sure that there is, I guess, that understanding of the background of where some of these products, these goods and services are coming from. And the last point with that is, what does that mean as well when we've got lower migrant workers that are coming into New Zealand? How do we ensure that we are keeping those industries going and getting Māori into some of those areas that currently are crying out for workers?
I mean, you know, what I'd like to see is this, you know, this period as, you know, as an opportunity for, you know, kind of all parts of that system to give themselves permission to do things, you know, to do things differently, and not, you know, perhaps break free from some of those constraints that you would, you know, put in place, you know, during kind of peacetime, if you like. So that they must have a tertiary degree in a particular discipline before you'll hire them for an entry-level job. I think if, you know, across, you know, all sectors, if employers can take, you know, kind of a more adaptive approach to that to create opportunities and be willing to take, you know, a measure of risk on some unusual candidates, I think that will pay dividends. And what was the second part of your question, sorry?
I think it was around sort of what are those, some of the changing labour market trends we've got at the moment? How can we make sure that Māori are able to access those opportunities where we currently see them emerging?
Right. Well,
and in the sense of, if we haven't already got them moving into those sectors, how do we make sure that now that there is a change disruption, that Māori are able to sort of, you know, take that forward and aren't sort of left behind as is sometimes the case?
Right. Well, so you're right about, you know, the education system as a whole takes a long time to shift, which is why I'm saying, you know, other organisations that are better able to to be nimble in that space and providing training. And this is where perhaps government can be helpful in terms of funding for retraining of people. But I think we need organisations. I think it's an opportunity for iwi to lead the way on agile, nimble retraining models. So, yeah.
Rob, anything to add on that in terms of what are some of the changes we might need to see coming in?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are plenty of changes in the skills development space happening, as I'm sure the listeners realise, with the Rove process. So having Māori involved in that process, particularly at a regional level, I think is really important. So for example, we're going to see these regional skills leadership groups being developed over the next 12 months. So I really hope that Māori have a seat at that table and are able to bring their own information into those groups about the skills that are needed from their perspective, but also get the chance to kind of listen to what other members are saying around the table about skill needs in their regions. The thing that worries me about those regional skills leadership groups is I used to work for the Department of Labour 20 years ago now, good heavens. And we used to talk about a lot of similar things about getting labour market information into regions so that key regional players could determine what skills were needed, and education institutions could take all that on board. It feels to me like a lot of deja vu. And what I haven't really seen change in that time is the type of labour market information that's available. And I hate to talk about data when we've been talking about job losses and people's lives are going to be affected by this recession, but I do think there is a need in New Zealand for a lot more kind of comprehensive information about the skills that employers need now more than ever, because there will be pockets of labour demand out there, and if unless those individual employers themselves get to have a say about it, we're not going to hear about it. What you need is comprehensive information collection out of the regions about skills that are needed. They need to be fed into those groups like the regional skills leadership groups, and they need to then feed that information to the local education providers, to the local immigration office, to the local MSD office, so we can start thinking about, okay, how do we get the best balance of local labour supply, particularly those people who are vulnerable and really need the work, against bringing in migrants as and when we need them. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about that.
Cool, thanks, Rob. Look, I think one of the last ones, and it goes to your point, Rob, around the likes of the regional skills leadership groups, but it's a question as well, or a theme, if you will, that's continued to come through this webinar around, look, a lot of the things we've been discussing for years, and they're also, I guess, elements that are, if you will, common sense. How do we actually get these into operation? I guess this is a bit of a loaded question and quite a wide question. If we are to see these changes come through, what are the actual processes we need to go through? Do we need to make sure that we're all hammering on government's door? Do we need to be doing this sort of locally ourselves, and we'll let the government sort of catch up when it eventually gets to it? What are some of those actual processes, the actual changes we can make, rather than sort of just talking about them? And I guess, Luke, I sort of direct that one a little bit with you. And again, I think over a coffee once we had a bit of a conversation that these do happen all the time. As these conversations continue to reoccur, what is the change that we need to make to move them from sort of discussion to actual reality?
Well, I think it's all of the above. What you're saying, I do think that there needs to be an element of banging on government's door for system change. Across a range of different elements in the education and training space, right through to individual employers, iwi, community groups acting locally. I think the times that we're in really are extraordinary, and I don't think we can afford to wait for government to do everything. But perhaps what we need is some middleware, some guides for employers on, taking on someone who's retraining, guides for iwi on, how to set up a retraining program, or and working with industry and so on. So I don't, specifically what that would look like, I don't know, but you've got up in the clouds, kind of banging on the door of Parliament and government agencies, and then you've got individual action, at the community level. So I think what we need is that middleware in the middle, and so perhaps that's going to take a bit of a coalition, of willing people across the community to try things and share what they've learned.
Awesome, and I think just to reflect on that as well, I mean, it's one of the questions that one of the specific questions we had is, are we here at Infometrics providing any of this insight through to government and Parliament and that? And the short answer to that is no, but we're trying to do more of that, and I guess we're trying to engage with some of those government agencies to pester them with the information, and I guess trying to support what I suspect is quite a campaign by other organisations up and down the country to make those changes happen. But I also agree, Luke, that middle stuff is quite important, also so that we don't spend time reinventing the wheel. There's some good ideas out there, and I think the point that I picked up on in your conversation there is how do we make sure that those ideas are pushed out, are replicated in other areas, so that not everyone is sort of spending their time doing the same thing. Where there's a good idea, we take it and we remix it for how that local area, that local industry might work. So I think that's a very, very viable sort of solution, and something that probably needs a bit more focus, and I think a lot of people on the call will reflect on that. Look, I think we might leave it there. I know we're just over 12, and I do know that everyone's got an incredibly busy life trying to move through this COVID pandemic and that. Thanks so much for coming along, everyone. Just a quick note, if you haven't already, I've put a few things in the chat and in questions. If you want a copy of the slides and that, feel free to email us, and there's an email address in the chat there, and we'll get back in touch, or get in touch with us, and we will try and get back to you. The emails are a little bit chock-a-block at the moment, but we will try and respond in time. We've tried to go through as many of the themes of the questions that you guys have brought up as possible. We haven't been able to go through all 68 of them through the time. So if you don't feel like we addressed your point quite clearly enough, again, feel free to email us and we'll try to get back to you with something a bit more substantive. If you want to keep in touch with us here at Infometrics as we sort of go through or have a conversation about some of the insights we've provided in that, do drop Rob or I a line, or sign up for our newsletter just to sort of keep in the loop. And we'd also love to hear from you guys if you've got things that you think we should consider discussing more, that we could do a little bit of research in that on. So really keen to hear that. Anything else from either of you, and sort of wrap up in summary there?
No, not really. Just thanks for your attention once again.
Awesome, fantastic. Thanks so much, guys. Thank you to everyone who's come on the call. It's been, I hope, really insightful. It's probably, I guess, given you a bit more information on where we see things going, a few questions of areas you might want to reflect on back in your own sort of areas. Please stay safe, look after yourselves, look after the family, and if you do ever need us, please do drop us an email. Thanks so much, team. I'll catch you later.